The wind howled like an ancient lament through the cracks of what was once an imposing castle. Cold stones, covered by a thick mantle of slippery moss, were all that remained of its former glory, now a precarious refuge atop the grey hill. There, banished from the village by a cruel lord and his sharp words of contempt, old Ilara, a grandmother with trembling hands and eyes that held the wisdom of ages, tried to light a fire with damp branches. Her two orphaned grandsons, Finn and Liam, too small for the harshness of the world, huddled against the damp walls, the echo of their own sighs lost in the decaying vastness. With each gust, the castle seemed to groan, and Ilara knew that the true battle was not against men, but against the relentless cold and the hunger that lurked in the shadows, while the forgotten legends of that place whispered promises of a long dormant secret. The biting night air was an invisible yet relentless enemy. Ilara, with numb fingers and a body bent by age and despair, tried in vain to coax a flame from the damp branches. The smoke, more promise than warmth, escaped through the cracks of what was once a home, now a stone skeleton that barely protected them from the wind's howl. Finn and Liam, small and fragile, trembled, huddled against the cold wall, their large, frightened eyes fixed on their grandmother, as if life itself depended on that fire that refused to ignite. With each breath of wind, the castle seemed to groan, a lament Ilara knew well. It was the sound of decay, of lost glory and of oblivion. Banished, humiliated, expelled from her village by a lord who saw poverty as a crime, Ilara now found herself the guardian of two innocent souls, trapped with her in the snare of cold and hunger. The guilt weighed more heavily than the castle stones. How could she, an old woman with trembling hands, protect her grandsons from the ferocity of a world that had discarded them? Her thoughts wandered, ghosts of a recent past. The village, once a refuge, was now a place of closed doors and scornful glances. The Lord, with his ruddy face and thundering voice, had pronounced the sentence without a shred of remorse. "Vagrants, there is no place for you here. Go to the ruins, where the forgotten belong." The words still burned, more than the cold that gnawed at their bones. The castle, or what remained of it, was a monument to resilience and ruin. Gigantic, grey, moss-covered stones formed walls that rose in silence, witnesses to ages. Legends whispered of its ancient inhabitants, of kings and queens, of magic and mysteries. But for Ilara, it was merely a precarious shelter, a tomb for hope. As her eyes swept the darkness, searching for something, anything that could serve as fuel, her gaze fell upon the vegetation clinging tenaciously to the ruins. It wasn't just moss and ivy. There was a profusion of plants, some creeping, others with broad, strangely vibrant leaves, growing in unusual abundance around the fallen stones and in the inner courtyards. The villagers called them castle weeds, warning children not to touch them, saying they were poisonous or brought bad luck, fruits of a cursed land. But Ilara, in her youth, had heard other stories whispered by her grandmother, a wise woman who knew the secrets of the forest. She spoke of the green healers, plants that held the memory of the earth, capable of extraordinary feats. Ancient legends, she would say, told that the castle's first builders did not erect it merely for war, but to protect a sacred garden, a plantation of life that flourished in secret, hidden beneath the cloak of oblivion. She had never paid much attention to these stories, dismissing them as old wives' tales. But now, with hunger tightening its grip and illness lurking, the memory of these weeds that defied the cold with their unusual vitality seemed to gain a new and strange meaning. They were different from the common forest plants, more robust, with an almost supernatural glow in their dark leaves. Ilara reached out her trembling hand, touching one of the broad, velvety leaves that sprouted from a crack in the stone. It was cold, yet strangely soft. A shiver ran down her spine, not of fear, but of a long, dormant curiosity. Could there be truth in the legends? Could salvation be hidden in plain sight, disguised as a pest, growing wild and forgotten around them? The flame stubbornly refused to ignite, the cold continued to bite, and the boy's sighs were almost inaudible. But for the first time in days, a different thought crept into Ilara's mind. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was just a question, a whisper from the past that the weeds seemed to echo in the darkness. The castle, in its ruin, held more than stones and laments. It held secrets, and perhaps, just perhaps, those secrets could be the key to survival. The battle against the cold and hunger continued, but now a new and strange promise, green and silent, began to sprout in the shadows. The touch of the leaf was a silent promise in the biting cold. It wasn't the rough, brittle texture of common plants that succumbed to winter, but something velvety, strangely soft, almost warm beneath Ilara's numb fingertips. A shiver ran down her spine, not of fear, but of a curiosity that life had long crushed. Her eyes, previously fixed on the smoke that stubbornly refused to become flame, now swept over the green profusion clinging to the stones, defying the frost with an almost insolent vitality. Liam coughed, a dry, hoarse sound that tore through the heavy silence of the ruined castle. Finn huddled even closer, uncontrollable little shivers shaking his fragile body. The sight of her grandsons, pale and exhausted, was a blow crueler than the icy wind. Guilt, a constant burden, tightened Ilara's chest. She had brought them to this forgotten place, to this tomb of hope. But what if it wasn't a tomb? What if, as her grandmother whispered on moonlit nights, the castle held more than just laments? The words of old Nona echoed in her mind, clear as if they had been spoken yesterday. "The green healers, my grandchild," she would say, her eyes twinkling with ancestral wisdom, "are not for the faint of heart, but for the desperate. They hide in plain sight where no one dares to look. They grow where the earth remembers its promise of life, even under the shadow of death." The villagers, with their fear and ignorance, had turned these plants into castle weeds, a warning to keep children away, a superstition to ward off misfortune. But Ilara now saw the cruel irony. What if bad luck was, in fact, a blessing in disguise, protected by the veil of contempt? She leaned down, her trembling hand reaching again for the broad, dark leaf. There was a subtle sheen on its surface, a luster that didn't seem natural under the faint light of night. It wasn't just moss, it was a complex web of stems and leaves, some creeping, others rising with a strange haughtiness, as if they knew their hidden worth. With each gust of wind, they swayed, but did not break, did not wither. They were resilient, stubborn, like the very life Ilara struggled to protect. Hunger gnawed at her insides, but the urgency to act was stronger. She had nothing to lose except the lives of her grandsons. The fire refused to ignite, and the cold advanced, relentless. The only hope, however faint and dangerous, seemed to sprout from the cracks of those ancient stones. Her grandmother spoke of infusions that soothe body and soul, of elixirs that steal fever and bring back warmth. She didn't have the utensils, nor the exact knowledge, but desperation was a harsh mistress. With a heavy sigh, Ilara began to gather the leaves. Not haphazardly, but with the reverence her grandmother had taught for dealing with the green healers. She chose the most robust ones, those that seemed to vibrate with the most life. The scent emanating from them was earthy, but with a fresh, almost minty touch, unlike any other plant she knew. It wasn't the acrid odor of poison, nor the sweet smell of wildflowers. It was something ancient, profound, like the earth itself. She gathered a small bundle, holding it against her chest. The leaves were cold, but seemed to radiate a strange energy, a promise. She looked at the old leather canteen she carried, now empty, and at the cracked clay pot she used to collect rainwater. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. The idea of making an infusion, a tea, began to form in her mind. She needed water, and she needed warmth. The flame stubbornly refused to ignite, but Ilara could no longer afford to wait. Finn and Liam's lives depended on her courage, on her willingness to defy fear and superstitions. She dragged herself to a more sheltered part of the ruins, where the humidity was lower. With stiff fingers, she tried again, this time with renewed determination. Each spark was a prayer, each breath a plea for help to the ancient spirits of the castle. As Ilara struggled with the fire, her mind buzzed with possibilities. What if the legends were true? What if these weeds were in fact the key to survival? The tension was palpable, a knot in her throat. She was on the edge of a precipice, with her grandson's lives hanging by a thread. The darkness of the night seemed to watch her. The wind whispered ancient secrets, and the leaves in her hands were the only hope. A calculated risk, a plunge into the unknown. The battle against the cold and hunger continued, but now Ilara had a new weapon, a green and silent weapon that defied logic and promised a miracle. The castle in its ruin was no longer a tomb, but an enigma, and Ilara was about to try to unravel it. The cold cut her skin like 1,000 invisible blades, but Ilara no longer felt the pain, only the urgency, the pressing need for a spark, for a flame that could ward off the shadow of death creeping through the castle corners. Her fingers, once numb, now seemed to possess a new life, driven by the sight of her grandsons, huddled and trembling. Liam coughed again, a hollow sound echoing against the stones, and Finn, with his large glazed eyes, seemed to fade with each breath. Ilara knelt, the bundle of dark green leaves held firmly in one hand. With the other, she scraped the flint against the steel again and again, the metallic sound tearing through the silence. Small sparks were born and died in the icy air, fleeting like the hope she tried to rekindle. With each failed attempt, a knot tightened in her throat. The damp wood, the thin twigs she had collected with so much effort, seemed to conspire against her. The wind, her constant enemy, blew through the cracks, threatening to extinguish any trace of warmth before it could even be born. But this time, something was different. Ilara's determination was not just a spark. It was a burning brazier in her chest. She could not fail, not now, not with the green healers in her hands, a silent promise from her grandmother. She remembered her words, "The flame of life, my grandchild, is born of persistence, even when the world tries to extinguish it." She blew, gently at first, then harder, focusing all her breath on the small pile of twigs and dry moss. A spark, more stubborn than the others, landed on the moss. For an instant, nothing. Then, a thin wisp of smoke, almost invisible, began to rise. Ilara blew again, with the delicacy of one caressing a newborn child. The wisp of smoke thickened, and a faint but unmistakable orange glow appeared. A small, hesitant flame flickered, fighting against the icy air. A sigh of relief escaped Ilara's lips, but she did not allow herself to relax. The flame was fragile, and her grandsons' lives still hung by a thread. With meticulous care, she added more thin twigs, feeding the fire with the reverence of one handling a treasure. Slowly, the flame grew, licking the wood, transforming the darkness into a circle of light and warmth. Liam's and Finn's eyes, previously dull, now reflected the golden glow, a spark of hope in their small, pale faces. The cracked clay pot was placed over the flames, and Ilara poured the little water remaining in her canteen. The water was cold, almost frozen, but the fire soon began to whisper its promise of warmth. As the water heated, Ilara looked at the leaves in her hands. They were robust, with an almost supernatural glow, and the earthy, minty scent intensified with the fire's heat. She wondered if she was about to offer poison or cure. The villagers' superstition, the warnings about castle weeds, fought against her faith in her grandmother and the desperation that drove her. When the water began to bubble, Ilara, with trembling but steady hands, plunged the leaves into the pot. The smell changed, becoming more pungent, more complex. A dark green began to spread through the water, dyeing it with the color of the deep forest. It was an infusion, a tea. But for Ilara, it was an act of faith, a silent prayer to the earth and to the ancient spirits her grandmother said inhabited the castle. She let the leaves steep for a while, watching the color deepen, the steam rise in fragrant spirals. The warmth of the fire, the smell of the infusion, everything seemed like a miracle in that forgotten place. Carefully, she removed the pot from the fire and waited for the liquid to cool slightly. The sight of her grandsons, still trembling, but now with their eyes fixed on the pot, was a constant reminder of the gamble she was taking. "Liam, Finn," she called, her voice hoarse with emotion and cold. "Come, my little ones, Grandma has made you some tea." Liam, the elder, dragged himself to her, his eyes curious and suspicious. Finn, weaker, had to be carried. Ilara took the empty canteen and, with her fingertips, poured some of the dark green liquid. The smell was strong, but not unpleasant. "Drink slowly, my child," Ilara instructed Liam, holding the canteen for him. Liam hesitated, his nose wrinkled by the strong smell. But the trust in his grandmother's gaze, and perhaps the desperation of his own hunger and cold, made him accept. He took a small sip. His eyes widened. There was no sweetness, no familiar taste of pure water. It was earthy, bitter, but with a surprising freshness that seemed to open his airways. He coughed again, but this time it seemed more a reflex of the taste than of illness. "It's strange, Grandma," he murmured, but took another sip, and then another. Ilara felt a momentary relief. Liam was drinking. Now it was Finn's turn. The little one was paler, weaker. Ilara cradled him in her arms, offering the canteen. Finn, without his brother's hesitation, opened his mouth and drank, a small but determined sip. His eyes closed for a moment, and Ilara feared the worst. But then Finn opened his eyes again, and a slight blush, almost imperceptible, seemed to appear on his cheeks. Ilara watched, her heart pounding in her chest. The fire crackled, shadows danced on the castle walls. Time seemed to drag. Liam, after drinking almost half the canteen, rested his head on his grandmother's shoulder. His cough lessened, and his breathing seemed less strained. Finn, in her arms, seemed to have fallen asleep, but his skin was not as cold as before. It was too early to tell. It was a risk, a desperate gamble, but for the first time in days, Ilara felt a glimmer of hope, a warmth that came not only from the fire, but from the silent promise of the green leaves in her hands. The castle weeds, despised and feared, could indeed be her grandmother's green healers. The castle, in its ruin, was not just a tomb, but a guardian of forgotten secrets, and Ilara had just unveiled the first of them. The night was still long, the cold still bit, but now there was a thread of life, a breath of warmth, and the strange and powerful fragrance of a green hope beginning to blossom in the shadows. The night dragged on, a heavy cloak of darkness and uncertainty over the castle ruins. Ilara watched, every fiber of her being stretched in tension. The fire, once a hesitant flame, now crackled with more vigor, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her anguish. Liam, huddled beside her, breathed more softly, the hollow sound of his cough diminishing to an occasional, almost imperceptible murmur. Finn, in her arms, slept a deeper sleep, his small hand clutching Ilara's shirt. The blush on his cheeks, once just a glimmer of hope, now seemed a little more defined, a faint sign of returning life. Ilara dared not move, fearing that any movement might break the fragile spell the infusion seemed to have cast. The earthy, minty scent of the leaves still lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of smoke and damp stone. It was a strange smell, but now no longer menacing. It was the smell of the gamble, of blind faith in an ancestral wisdom that modern reason had forgotten. Hours dissolved into darkness. Ilara felt the cold in her bones, but the urgency of her grandsons had superseded any personal discomfort. Her mind revisited the villagers' words, the disapproving glances, the whispers about the castle weeds, poisonous, cursed. But then, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, clear as the sound of a bell. "The earth is wise, my grandchild. It offers healing where least expected, if we have eyes to see and hearts to believe." She touched Finn's forehead. It was no longer icy. It was warm, almost feverish, but not with the cold of death that had frightened her before. It was a different warmth, a warmth of struggle, of life. Liam stirred, a small groan escaping his lips, and Ilara held her breath, but the boy merely snuggled closer, his breathing regular and deep. The cough did not return, not for a long time. With each passing moment, the tension lessened a little, replaced by a thin thread of relief. But fear still lurked. What if it was just a temporary effect? What if the improvement was an illusion? A last breath before the illness claimed their small bodies? Superstition was a powerful enemy, harder to fight than cold or hunger. It took root in the mind, whispering doubts, feeding despair. But Ilara had the leaves in her hands, and the image of her grandsons, now sleeping in relative peace. She looked at the empty clay pot, at the withered leaves lying at the bottom. They had fulfilled their promise, or at least were beginning to fulfill it. The castle, once a place of terror and despair, began to reveal itself as a sanctuary, a guardian of long-forgotten secrets. The sky began to lighten, a pale grey replacing the deep black of night. The first rays of sun crept through the cracks in the ruins, painting the stones with golden and rosy hues. Ilara felt an overwhelming weariness, but also a renewed energy, a strength that came not from rest, but from hope. Liam opened his eyes, blinking against the faint light. His eyes, previously glazed and dull, now held a spark of curiosity. He looked at Ilara, then at Finn, and a small smile, weak but genuine, appeared on his lips. "Grandma," he murmured, his voice still hoarse, but stronger than before. "I'm thirsty." Ilara felt tears well up in her eyes. Thirsty, not coughing, not pain, not the deadly cold. Thirsty. It was a sign of life, a return to normalcy. She picked up the canteen, which she had refilled with the remaining infusion, and offered it to Liam. The boy drank with more eagerness this time, without the hesitation of the previous night. Finn also began to stir, a small yawn escaping his lips. His eyes opened, and he looked at Ilara with an expression of childlike confusion. "Grandma," he said, his voice a little stronger, a little less weak. He did not cough. Ilara embraced her two grandsons, tears streaming freely down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of a relief so profound it hurt. Finn's fever seemed to have subsided considerably, and Liam's breathing was almost normal. The danger had not completely disappeared, but the shadow of death had retreated, at least for now. The weeds were not poison. They were the cure. The revelation hit Ilara with the force of thunder. She had not only found a temporary solution, she had discovered a treasure, a legacy from her grandmother, hidden in plain sight, despised and feared. The castle in its ruin was not just a refuge, but a natural pharmacy, a secret garden of healing. From that moment on, Ilara's mission changed. It was not just to survive, but to understand these plants, to unravel their secrets, to learn to use them not just for survival, but for life. The tension was still high, for the journey was far from over. There was more to be discovered, more to be understood about this ancient place and its hidden wonders. But now, Ilara had a new weapon, a new hope, and the silent promise that life, even in ruins, always finds a way to flourish. She looked at the plants around the cabin, no longer with suspicion, but with profound reverence. The true journey was just beginning. The tight embrace of Liam and Finn was a balm for Ilara's soul, a relief so profound that tears streamed, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. Finn's fever had subsided, a healthy flush returning to his pale cheeks. Liam, though still weak, drank the infusion with an eagerness Ilara hadn't seen in days. The cough, once a constant and terrifying sound, had diminished to an occasional, almost imperceptible whisper. The shadow of death, which hung so heavily over them, had retreated, at least for now. But as the rising sun painted the stones of what remained of the ancient castle with golden hues, a new and disturbing truth began to manifest in Ilara's mind. The weeds were not poison, they were the cure. The revelation hit her with the force of thunder, but also with the sweetness of a promise. She had not only found a temporary solution for her children, she had discovered a treasure, a legacy from her grandmother, hidden in plain sight, despised and feared. The castle in its ruin was not just a refuge, but a natural pharmacy, a secret garden of healing. As she watched her children sleep a more peaceful sleep, Ilara's hand instinctively slid to her rounded belly. The life growing within her was a constant reminder of her own fragility, of the illness that slowly consumed her, of the cough that assailed her at night, of the weariness that stole her breath. If those weeds could bring Liam and Finn back from the brink of the abyss, could they also cure her? Could they give her and her baby a chance to live? The question echoed in her mind, laden with a hope so intense it was frightening. The sun was already high when Ilara, with her children still asleep, ventured out of the cabin. The cold morning air stung her skin, but the urgency in her heart propelled her. She looked at the plants around, no longer with suspicion, but with profound reverence. What once seemed like a wild, untamed thicket now revealed itself as a green carpet of possibilities. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of different species, each with its unique leaves, flowers, and stems. It was a living tapestry, woven by nature and perhaps by human hands long forgotten. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, not the warnings about poisons, but the lessons about observation, about patience, about the wisdom of the earth. "Every leaf has a story, Ilara," her grandmother used to say, "and every root a secret. Nature speaks, if we know how to listen." But how could she listen? How could she discern cure from danger, life from death, amidst such abundance? The tension was palpable. Her children's improvement was a miracle, but also a gamble. She had used the leaves her grandmother had pointed out, the castle weeds, but what about the others? How many other healing plants were hidden there, and how many were truly poisonous, as the villagers warned? The fear of making a mistake, of picking the wrong plant, of preparing the infusion improperly, was an overwhelming weight. Her own life and the life of her baby depended on it. Ilara began to walk slowly, her eyes sweeping the ground. The cabin was nestled among ancient ruins, crumbled stone walls and moss-covered arches that stretched into what appeared to be a vast walled garden, now completely overgrown with vegetation. It wasn't just a handful of herbs, it was an entire plantation, a miniature forest of medicinal plants, carefully cultivated and then abandoned to time. It was the ancient plantation her grandmother spoke of, a forgotten legacy, waiting to be rediscovered. She knelt, feeling the dampness of the earth through her clothes. She touched the leaves she had used the night before, the same leaves that had saved her children. They were a deep green, with small visible veins and a subtle minty scent. She tried to memorize every detail, every nuance, but beside them other plants grew, some similar, others completely different. Some had vibrant flowers, others dark, shiny berries. What was the difference? How could she learn? The solitude of that place, once a burden, now revealed itself as both a blessing and a curse. No one would help her, no one would judge her, but also no one would guide her. She was alone with her children, her unborn baby, and a garden of secrets that could be her salvation or her undoing. With every leaf she touched, every aroma she inhaled, Elara felt a mixture of fascination and terror. The journey was just beginning, and it was a journey she would have to walk alone, guided only by the memory of her grandmother and the urgency of her own survival. The castle, once a place of despair, was now her school, her laboratory, her last hope. She needed to learn to read the language of the earth, to decipher the secrets of the weeds before time ran out for her and for the new life she carried. The tension was still high, for ignorance was an enemy as dangerous as disease, and Elara's biological clock kept ticking. The urgency was a fire burning in Elara's chest, more intense than the morning cold. Her children were safe for now, but the shadow hanging over her was more persistent, more intimate. The life growing in her womb was a constant reminder of her own fragility, of the cough that stole her breath, of the weariness that consumed her. If those leaves had rescued Liam and Finn from the brink of the abyss, could they also give her and her baby a chance to live? The question echoed, a mixture of hope and terror. The sun was already high, but the forest of weeds remained shrouded in a mix of mystery and promise. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of different species, each with its unique leaves, flowers and stems, formed a living tapestry. It was a natural pharmacy, yes, but without labels, without instructions. How to discern cure from poison, life from death, amidst such abundance? Her grandmother's voice, once a guide, now seemed a distant whisper. The lessons about observation and patience, more an enigma than an answer. Elara knelt, the dampness of the earth penetrating her clothes. Her fingers brushed the leaves that had cured her grandsons. Deep green, fine veins, a subtle, minty scent. She tried to engrave every detail in her mind, as if she could create a sensory map. But beside them, other plants grew, some similar, others completely strange. Vibrant flowers, dark, shiny berries. With each touch, a wave of fascination and terror washed over her. The fear of making a mistake, of picking the wrong plant, of preparing the infusion improperly was an overwhelming weight. Her own life and the life of her baby depended on it. The solitude of that place was a double-edged sword. No one would help her. No one would judge her, but also no one would guide her. She was alone with her children, her unborn baby, and a garden of secrets that could be her salvation or her undoing. Time did not stop, and the cough, which now assailed her more frequently, was a cruel reminder of the urgency. She began to walk, her eyes sweeping the ground. The cabin was nestled among ancient ruins, crumbled stone walls and moss-covered arches that stretched into what appeared to be a vast walled garden, now completely overgrown with vegetation. It wasn't just a handful of herbs, it was an entire plantation, a miniature forest of medicinal plants, carefully cultivated and then abandoned to time. It was the ancient plantation her grandmother spoke of, a forgotten legacy waiting to be rediscovered. As she walked, her eyes caught something unusual. Among the mossy stones of a crumbled wall, there were carvings. They were not random, but seemed to form symbols, worn by time, but still discernible. She approached, clearing the moss with her hands. They were stylized representations of plants, some she vaguely recognized, others completely unknown. Beside each symbol, there was a small carving like a single stroke, 2 strokes, or a small spiral. Were they numbers? Indicators. Elara's mind began to race. Her grandmother had spoken of the wisdom of the earth, but also of the wisdom of the ancients. Could this be a type of map, a key to unraveling the secrets of the plantation? She recognized the symbol of the plant she had used for her children, a three-pointed leaf with a single stroke beside it. One stroke. What could it mean? The discovery brought a thread of hope, but also a new layer of tension. Those symbols were a language she did not speak. How to decipher them? She needed a starting point, a method. The plant that cured her children was the only link she had. If its symbol had one stroke, what would the other symbols and their respective strokes or spirals mean? Ilara spent hours, under the sun that now crept through the trees, comparing the real plants with the carvings on the stones. She found another plant that resembled one of the symbols, one with small purple flowers and two strokes beside it. She remembered her grandmother speaking of plants that warmed and plants that cooled. Could the strokes indicate potency or use? Hunger began to bite, and weariness threatened to overcome her. But the discovery of those inscriptions had ignited a new flame in her spirit. She was not completely alone. The ancients, perhaps her own lineage, had left a guide. She needed to learn to read. With the sun beginning to set, Ilara gathered some leaves from the plant with purple flowers and two strokes, and a little more from the original one-stroke plant. She dared not use them yet, not for herself. First, she needed to observe, compare, try to understand the logic behind those symbols. Ignorance was a dangerous enemy, and she could not afford to err. The journey was just beginning, and each step was a leap in the dark, guided only by the urgency of the life she carried and the silent promise of a forgotten legacy. The castle, once a place of despair, was now her school, her laboratory, her last hope. And Ilara's biological clock kept ticking. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, but Ilara barely noticed the beauty. Hunger gnawed, and weariness threatened to overcome her, but the discovery of those inscriptions had ignited a new flame in her spirit, one that burned stronger than exhaustion. She was not completely alone. The ancients, perhaps her own lineage, had left a guide. She needed to learn to read. With the leaves of the one-stroke plant and the two-stroke plant in her hands, Ilara returned to the cabin, her mind buzzing. Liam and Finn, already awake, played silently with some twigs on the dirt floor, their pale faces now bearing a healthy glow that warmed Ilara's heart. They were safe for now, but the shadow hanging over her was more persistent, more intimate. The life growing in her womb was a constant reminder of her own fragility, of the cough that stole her breath, of the weariness that consumed her. Night fell, bringing with it a biting cold that seeped through the cracks in the cabin. Ilara lit a small fire in the hearth, the warmth dancing on the wooden walls, casting long, distorted shadows. Sitting by the fire, with her children already asleep again, she spread the leaves on a piece of old cloth. The three-pointed leaves, deep green and mint-scented, that had cured her children. And the new ones, with small purple flowers and a more earthy aroma, which she had associated with the two-stroke symbol. Every leaf has a story, Ilara, and every root a secret. Nature speaks, if we know how to listen. Her grandmother's voice echoed, but now Ilara felt that it was not just nature speaking, but the ancestors themselves, through those symbols carved in stone. What did one stroke mean? And two strokes? Her grandmother had spoken of plants that warmed and plants that cooled, of those that calmed and those that invigorated. Orchum, could the strokes be indicators of these properties, or perhaps of dosage, of potency? The fear of making a mistake was an overwhelming weight. Her own life and the life of her baby depended on it. She could not afford to experiment blindly. She needed a method, a way to test without exposing herself to mortal danger. Her eyes swept the interior of the cabin. There were few belongings, but her grandmother had always taught her to be resourceful. An iron pot, a dull knife, a clay pot. She took a small portion of the one-stroke leaves, the ones she knew were safe. She boiled them in water, observing the color of the infusion, the steam rising, the scent intensifying. It was a gentle, comforting tea. She remembered her grandmother using it for fevers and pains. It was a plant that calmed, that cooled the inflamed body. Next, she did the same with the two-stroke leaves. The infusion had a slightly darker color, and the smell was stronger, more pungent. She dared not taste it. Instead, she took a small piece of fabric and dipped it in the liquid, carefully applying it to a small scratch on her arm. She observed. No tingling, no immediate redness. But the spot seemed to warm slightly. Could it be a plant that warms? Ilara's mind began to draw connections. If the one-stroke plant calmed and cooled, and the two-stroke plant warmed, perhaps the strokes indicated a scale of intensity or a category of effect. One stroke for the gentle, the calming, two strokes for something more potent, perhaps stimulating or warming. And the spirals. What could they mean? The cough assailed her again, a cruel reminder of the urgency. She didn't have time for a complete botanical study. She needed to focus on her own healing. The illness that consumed her was a persistent fever, an inflammation in her lungs, a weakness that stole her life. She needed something that cooled, that calmed the storm in her body. The one-stroke plant was a start, but would it be enough for the severity of her condition? She remembered her grandmother speaking of combining herbs, of how the synergy of different plants could enhance their effects. If the one-stroke plant was gentle, perhaps there were others that combined could be more effective for her illness. But how to identify these others? Ilara decided that the next day she would return to the carvings with a new eye. She would look for symbols similar to the one-stroke plant, perhaps with small variations, or with the same number of strokes. She needed to expand her vocabulary of safe and effective plants. She needed more one-strokes, or something that complemented their effect. With this determination, she lay down, the scent of the herbs still lingering in the air. Uncertainty was still a heavy burden, but hope, once just a thin thread, was now a stronger cord, woven by the secrets of the ancients. The journey was just beginning, and each step was a leap in the dark, guided only by the urgency of the life she carried and the silent promise of a forgotten legacy. The castle, once a place of despair, was now her school, her laboratory, her last hope. And Ilara's biological clock kept ticking. She needed to learn to read the language of the earth, to decipher the secrets of the weeds, before time ran out for her and for the new life she carried. The tension was still high, for ignorance was an enemy as dangerous as disease. And Ilara's biological clock kept ticking. She closed her eyes, but her mind continued to work, imagining the symbols, the leaves, the secrets waiting to be revealed. Morning arrived, but brought no relief. Ilara's cough was deeper, wetter, and each breath seemed to scratch her lungs. The weariness of the previous night, instead of diminishing, had intensified, a heavy fog threatening to swallow her determination. Her children still slept. Their serene faces a painful reminder of what was at stake. The life in her womb, a silent pulse of hope, was also an relentless clock. She had no time for weakness. With a monumental effort, Ilara rose. The scent of the previous night's infusion still lingered in the air, a reminder of her attempt to decipher the unspeakable. She needed to return to the walls, to those ancient symbols, with the clarity that fever and exhaustion stubbornly tried to steal. If the one-stroke plant calmed and cooled, and the two-stroke plant warmed, she needed more one-strokes, perhaps a combination of them, to combat the fire consuming her from within. The sun was already high when Ilara reached the walled garden again. The vegetation seemed even denser, more imposing under the daylight, a green labyrinth of secrets. She approached the carvings, running her fingers over the cold stones, feeling the rough texture and the moss that stubbornly grew. Her eyes swept the symbols, searching for patterns, for repetitions, for anything that could expand her limited vocabulary of healing. She focused on the symbols with a single stroke. There was the three-pointed leaf, which she already knew, but further on, hidden beneath a cascade of ivy, she found another. It was a delicate flower, with 5 small petals and a single stroke beside it. The corresponding plant grew nearby, a clump of light green foliage, with tiny white flowers that exhaled a soft, almost imperceptible perfume. Ilara knelt, observing it. It seemed so fragile, so innocent. Could it have the same calming or cooling effect as the three-pointed plant? Her grandmother had spoken of nature's diversity, of how many plants could have similar effects, but with different nuances. Some calm the mind, others the body. Some cool fever, others inflammation. Ilara's mind, despite the fog of illness, began to draw a map. If the three-pointed leaf was for fever and pain, and perhaps this new one-stroke flower was for inflammation or irritation. Her cough, her difficulty breathing, were clear signs of lung inflammation. She continued her search with a new urgency. She needed something that would attack the root of her suffering. Further on, in a section of the wall that seemed to have been intentionally protected, she discovered a more complex carving. It was a twisted root, with a single stroke beside it. The plant associated with it was a low shrub with broad, dark leaves and small red berries. The root, when she carefully unearthed it, had an earthy, strong smell. A root. Her grandmother always said that roots held the greatest potency, the essence of healing. The discovery of the root filled her with a new but cautious hope. If the three-pointed leaf was a tea for fever and the 5-petaled flower for inflammation, perhaps the one-stroke root was the key to weakness or to strengthening the body in general. The idea of combining the plants began to take shape in her mind. Not just one, but perhaps 2 or even 3 one-stroke plants working together. A synergy, as her grandmother had taught. Carefully, Ilara gathered some of the white flowers and a piece of the twisted root, along with more leaves from the three-pointed plant. The sun was beginning to dip in the sky, and weariness pulled her down, but determination propelled her. She needed to act, and quickly. Back in the cabin, with Liam and Finn already awake and asking for attention, Ilara lit the fire. The cough assailed her more frequently now, and the fever seemed to have intensified. There was no more time for cautious tests on scratches. It was all or nothing. She took the iron pot and put water to boil. First, the 3-pointed leaves, which she knew were safe and effective for fever. Then, the delicate white flowers with their gentle perfume. Lastly, the piece of root. She cut it into small pieces, feeling the resistance of the fiber. As the herbs boiled, the rising steam was a mixture of aromas, a complex bouquet of earth, mint, and something floral. It was the scent of hope, mixed with the scent of risk. The infusion became darker than any she had made before, a deep amber hue. Ilara poured some into her clay pot, watching the steam dance. Her children watched her with silent curiosity, sensing the tension in the air. She hesitated for a moment, the hot pot in her hands. Ignorance was a dangerous enemy, and she was about to take a leap in the dark, guided only by ancient carvings and the distant voice of her grandmother. But the alternative was the certainty of death. With a trembling sigh, Ilara brought the pot to her lips. The liquid was hot, earthy, with a hint of mint and a subtle bitterness from the root. She drank slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her throat and chest. The minutes that followed were an eternity. She waited, alert to any sign, any reaction. A tingling, a dizziness. Nothing. Just the comforting warmth settling in her stomach. Then, a slight chill ran through her, not from cold, but as if something inside her was yielding. The cough, which had been a constant irritation, seemed to lessen a little. Her breathing, though still difficult, did not seem as scratchy. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A spark, a small but undeniable spark of relief. Ilara closed her eyes, a solitary tear escaping down her face. It was not the cure she knew. It was just the beginning, but it was a beginning. The ancients had spoken, and she had begun to listen. The biological clock still ticked, but now, perhaps, she had bought a little more time. The journey was far from over, and each sip of that infusion was an act of faith, a step forward in the dangerous dance between life and death. The spark of relief, however faint, was a balm to Ilara's exhausted soul. The warmth of the infusion spread, and with it a sense of clearing, as if an ancient cobweb was being swept from her lungs. The cough did not cease completely, but lost its ferocity, becoming softer, less painful. Each breath, though still an effort, no longer brought the sensation of internal scratching, but rather a slight freshness, a promise of clean air. She felt the fire of the fever recede a little, a subtle cooling that coursed through her veins, replacing the suffocating heat with a more bearable temperature. It was not the cure she knew. The illness was still there, a persistent shadow. But for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt she was fighting on equal footing, no longer in a desperate retreat. Her children, Liam and Finn, played silently in the corner, oblivious to the silent battle their mother waged. Their occasional laughter was like bells, reminding her of what was at stake, of the life she needed to protect, of the life growing within her. The infusion, with its earthy and bitter taste, was now an elixir of hope, a silent testament that the ancients had left a path, if she could only learn to read it. Night fell, and with it a more peaceful sleep than Ilara had had in weeks. The cough woke her a few times, but it was a weaker, less exhausting cough. In the morning, the fog of fever had considerably lessened. She was still weak, her body aching from the effort and prolonged illness, but the desperate urgency of before had been replaced by a calmer, more focused determination. The combined infusion had worked. It had brought relief. It had bought time. But time was still a scarce luxury. She needed more, not just relief, but a cure. And for that, she knew she would need to go beyond the one strokes. With the morning sun illuminating the walled garden, Ilara returned to the carvings with a new perspective. Her fingers traced the symbols, no longer with the uncertainty of before, but with a mind sharpened by experience. The three-pointed leaf, the five-petaled flower, the twisted root, all with a single stroke, were now part of her healing vocabulary. They calmed, cooled, strengthened. But what came next? Her eyes fixed on the symbols with two strokes. They were rarer, more complex, and seemed to be associated with more robust-looking plants, some with darker leaves, others with vibrantly colored flowers. There was a carving of a broad, serrated leaf with two strokes beside it. The corresponding plant was a dense shrub, with leaves that, when rubbed, released a strong, pungent smell. Her grandmother had spoken of plants that warmed, that stimulated, that purified. Were these the two-stroke plants? Ilara's cough, though diminished, was still a reminder that she needed something that cooled and calmed inflammation, not something that warmed it. Intuition warned her to be cautious. A mistake now could be fatal. If the one-stroke plant was gentle and curative for her condition, the two-stroke plant could be too potent, or have an effect contrary to what she needed at the moment. She could not afford to experiment, but there were also the symbols with spirals. They were the most enigmatic of all. Some were beside one-stroke plants, others beside two-stroke plants. A simple spiral, a double spiral, a spiral that seemed to unfold into a flower. What did they mean? A method of preparation, a specific dosage, a ritualistic use. Her grandmother had mentioned that some herbs needed to be harvested at specific moon phases, or prepared with a chant, or combined in very precise ways to release their true potency. Could the spirals be a guide to these forgotten rituals? Ilara felt a shiver. The complexity of the system was overwhelming. She had deciphered the first level, but with each answer, 10 new questions arose. It was as if the ancients had left a book, and she had barely learned the alphabet. She focused on a new one-stroke carving that she had overlooked before. It was a small blue flower, almost hidden beneath the leaves of a larger plant. The symbol was delicate, a 4-petaled flower with a single stroke. The corresponding plant exhaled a soft, slightly sweet aroma. Ilara carefully harvested it. If the 3-pointed leaf was for fever and the 5-petaled flower for inflammation, perhaps this blue flower was for pain or to calm the mind, an effect she desperately needed to rest and concentrate. The idea of a perfect combination began to form in her mind. Not just one plant, but a symphony of herbs, each contributing its melody to the cure. The previous night's infusion had been a trio. Perhaps the complete cure required a quartet, or a quintet, or even more. But how to know the proportion, the order, the method of preparation? The spirals haunted her again. She needed more information about the spirals. She returned to the carvings, looking for spirals associated with one-stroke plants, the ones she already knew were safe. She found a simple spiral next to the symbol of the 3-pointed leaf, and another, slightly different, next to the 5-petaled flower. The spiral seemed to indicate a circular movement, a mixing perhaps, or a grinding. The cough assailed her again, stronger this time, a cruel reminder that the relief was temporary. Ilara's biological clock kept ticking. She had made progress, but the finish line was still far away, obscured by complex symbols and ancient mysteries. She needed to decipher the spirals, understand the potency of the 2 strokes, and above all, find the exact combination that would bring not only relief, but the definitive cure for her and for the life she carried. The journey was just beginning, and each step was a leap in the dark, guided only by the urgency of the life she carried and the silent promise of a forgotten legacy. Ilara felt a tug in her belly, a gentle but insistent reminder of the life growing within her. There was no time for prolonged hesitation. With each cough, each pang of pain, each moment of weariness, the image of her baby became more vivid, more urgent. She needed to go beyond theory, beyond the carvings, and turn knowledge into action. Her eyes returned to the spirals. They were the key, she knew. A simple spiral next to the 3-pointed leaf, a double spiral next to the 5-petaled flower. And then she noticed something that had escaped her attention before, a tiny detail, almost erased by time and moss. Next to a double spiral, there was a small drawing, almost a pictogram. It seemed to be a hand with fingers curled as if crushing something, and below a shallow bowl, a grinding. The spiral indicated not just a movement, but a process. Not just boiling, but perhaps macerating, crushing, releasing the essence in a more potent form. Her grandmother had spoken of the importance of preparation, of awakening the plant. Could this be it? With her heart pounding, Ilara picked up a small, smooth stone and a clay bowl she used for mixing flour. She gathered more leaves from the 3-pointed plant and placed them in the bowl. With the stone, she began to crush them, following the circular motion of the spiral, feeling the fibers break, releasing a more intense, more concentrated aroma than that of the simple infusion. Dark green juice began to form, a thick aromatic paste. She boiled a small amount of water and added the paste, watching the color deepen instantly. The smell was stronger, more earthy, almost pungent. It was the same plant, but its essence seemed to have been amplified. She poured some into her pot, watching the dense steam rise. This time there was no hesitation. She drank the hot liquid, feeling the more pronounced bitterness, the more vibrant mint. And then the effect came. Not a subtle tingling, but a wave of warmth that spread through her chest, followed by a deep cooling, as if a cold breeze was sweeping the fever from her body. The cough, which moments before had been a constant irritation, silenced. Her breathing became easier, deeper, as if her lungs had been opened. It was more than relief. It was a feeling of cleansing, of renewal. The difference was remarkable, undeniable. The grinding, the spiral, had unlocked a power that the simple infusion had only scratched. She had found a new level of understanding. With this new revelation, Ilara returned to the carvings, now with renewed determination. If the simple spiral meant grinding for the one-stroke plants, what would the double spiral mean? And the two-stroke symbols, with their promises of deeper healing, but also greater risk? Her eyes fell upon the carving of the broad, serrated leaf, the pungent-smelling plant, with two strokes beside it. And next to it a double spiral, more complex, with a small drawing that seemed to be a fire, a flame. Fire, not just boiling, but perhaps roasting, burning, or preparing over high heat for a specific time. Her grandmother had spoken of fire plants, which required intense heat to release their most powerful properties. The tension in Ilara intensified. If grinding had amplified the effect of the one-stroke plants, what would fire do to the two-stroke plants? Would it be the definitive cure or a potent poison? The risk was immense, but the promise of total cure was an irresistible beacon. She knew she could not afford to test blindly. The life she carried was too precious. But now she had a direction. The spirals were the way, and fire was the next step. She needed to find the corresponding plant, and then, with the same caution and faith that had guided her so far, try to decipher the mystery of the double spiral and the fire. The journey was deepening, and each discovery brought with it a new and dangerous challenge. The cure was closer, but the abyss between her and salvation seemed deeper than ever. The grinding, the spiral. It had been a leap in the dark, but the reward was immediate, undeniable. The relief that the simple infusion had only scratched. The macerated paste had delivered in waves of warmth and cooling, silencing the cough, opening her lungs. It was more than relief. It was a promise, a glimpse of the cure. But the promise came with an even greater challenge. If the one-stroke plants and their grinding spiral were the alphabet, the two-stroke plants and their double spirals were the complex grammar, and the fire pictogram was a word whose meaning she still dared not utter aloud. The tug in her belly was a constant reminder, a biological clock that allowed no hesitation. Each heartbeat of her baby was a tick-tock, propelling her forward into the unknown. Ilara returned to the carvings, her mind now a whirlwind of possibilities and fears. Her grandmother had spoken of fire plants, herbs that, according to legends, were capable of curing the deepest ailments, but which required an almost reverential respect in their preparation. Fire. It was not just heat. It was transformation, purification, but also destruction. One mistake, and the cure could become poison. Her eyes fixed again on the carving of the broad, serrated leaf, the robust, pungent-smelling plant she had noticed in the walled garden. Beside it, the double spiral, more intricate, and the small drawing, a flame. But it was not a wild bonfire. It was a contained flame, almost stylized, beneath what appeared to be a small vessel. It was not to burn the plant directly, but to heat it in a specific way. Her grandmother had mentioned that some herbs needed to be cooked down to their essence, others roasted to the right point, and some even smoked to release their properties. Ilara stood up, determination hardening in her gaze. She needed the plant. The serrated leaf was unmistakable. It grew in a darker corner of the garden, a dense shrub, its leaves a darker green, almost velvety to the touch. When rubbed, the pungent, almost medicinal smell was stronger than she remembered. It was a plant of power. She could feel it. Carefully, she gathered some leaves, feeling the weight of responsibility in her hands. Back in the cabin, she lit the small wood stove, watching the flames dance, the pictogram of fire beneath the vessel. It was not a bonfire, but controlled heat. She took a small clay pot, the same one she used for infusions, but this time the intention was different. It was not just boiling, it was transforming. She placed the leaves in the dry pot, without water, and carefully positioned it over the weakest embers of the stove. The pungent smell intensified, mingling with the aroma of wood smoke. The leaves began to wilt, to change color from a dark green to a more brownish, almost toasted shade. Ilara watched, tense, every millimeter of the transformation. She could not let them burn, but they needed to be awakened by the heat. Time seemed to stretch and shrink. Every second was an eternity. Sweat ran down her forehead, not just from the heat of the fire, but from anxiety. It was as if she was dancing on the edge of a precipice, with the life of her child and her own hanging by a thread. When the leaves reached a dark golden hue, releasing a sweeter and less pungent aroma, she removed them from the fire. The smell was now complex, earthy and slightly sweet, with a residual hint of the original pungency. With the leaves transformed by fire, Ilara placed them in the clay bowl, and with the same smooth stone she had used to grind the one-stroke plants, began to crush them. The texture was different, more brittle, and the resulting powder was fine and aromatic. She boiled a little water and added the powder, watching the water take on a deep amber, almost reddish color. The steam rising was dense, laden with the essence of the fire plant. Ilara's heart beat like a war drum. This was the moment. She poured some of the liquid into her pot, watching the steam dance. The smell was intoxicating, powerful. There was no going back. With a sigh that carried all her hope and her fear, she brought the pot to her lips. The first sip was a shock. It was not bitter like the others, but an intense heat spread through her mouth and throat, descending her esophagus like a river of fire. It was not a painful burning, but a wave of energy that radiated from her chest to every extremity of her body. Her muscles, previously aching and heavy, seemed to vibrate with a new strength. The weariness that had accompanied her for months began to recede, replaced by a mental clarity she had not felt since before the illness. The cough, which had been silenced by the grinding, seemed to want to return, but was contained, not by suppression, but by a feeling of deep cleansing in her lungs. It was as if her airways were being cleared, purified from the inside out. She felt a tingling in her toes and fingers, a sensation of life returning, of blockages being undone. It was overwhelming, almost frightening in its intensity. She felt a slight tremor, but not of weakness, but of a newly awakened energy. Her grandmother had spoken of awakening the life force. Could this be it? The fire plant not only calmed or cooled, it rebuilt, purified, strengthened. Ilara closed her eyes, absorbing the torrent of sensations. The cure was not a gentle relief, but an internal battle, a reconfiguration of her very being. The two-stroke plant, prepared with fire, was a potent catalyst, a force of nature. She had crossed a threshold. The abyss still existed, but now she had a tool, a powerful weapon. The journey was far from over. She had deciphered the fire, but the perfect combination, the symphony of herbs that would bring the definitive cure, still awaited her. She would need to learn to dose this potency, to combine it with the gentleness of the one-stroke plants, to understand the double spirals in their entirety. But for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt genuine hope, a growing certainty that she and her baby would survive. The forest, once a refuge of despair, was now a sanctuary of knowledge, and she was ready to unravel its deepest secrets. The torrent of sensations from the fire plant subsided, leaving Ilara in a state of exhaustion and euphoria. Her body still vibrated, but the overwhelming intensity calmed, revealing a clarity and strength she hadn't felt in years. The cough had completely disappeared, and her breathing was deep, unimpeded. It was as if every cell in her body had been awakened from a deep sleep, shaken by a primordial energy. But the cure was not complete. There was a slight stiffness in her muscles, a residue of the internal battle that the fire plant had instigated. It was a raw, transformative power, but one that needed to be refined, directed. Her grandmother had spoken of the symphony of herbs, the art of combining different plants to create a harmonious effect where one complemented the other, enhancing its virtues and mitigating its excesses. The fire plant was the conductor, but it needed its orchestra. The tug in her belly, now softer but still present, was a reminder that time was her most relentless enemy. Ilara dragged herself back to the carvings, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities and fears. If the simple spiral was grinding and the double spiral with fire was transformation, what came next? Her eyes scanned the symbols, searching for a new clue, a new combination. It was then that she noticed a pattern she had previously ignored. A carving that showed the serrated leaf of the fire plant, but not alone. Beside it, there was a representation of the leaf of the one-stroke plant she had used first, the one that relieved fever and pain. And between the two, a more elaborate double spiral with a small central dot, like an eye. Below, a new pictogram. It was not fire, nor boiling water, but what appeared to be a bowl with bubbling liquid, and above it, a small drawing of a cloud of steam. Combined infusion, Ilara whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. It was not just boiling or roasting, it was a preparation that required the fusion of essences, a more subtle alchemy. The eye in the center of the double spiral seemed to indicate a point of balance, a precise proportion. Her grandmother had mentioned the turning point, the moment when the properties of the herbs united into a new entity. With a new wave of determination, Ilara stood up. First, the fire plant. She repeated the process of roasting the serrated leaves over the embers, observing the transformation from dark green to dark golden, releasing the complex and earthy aroma. Then, she crushed them into a fine powder. Next, it was the turn of the one-stroke plant. She harvested the fresh leaves, soft to the touch, and macerated them with the smooth stone, creating a vibrant green paste. Now the challenge was the combination, the pictogram of the bubbling bowl and the steam. It was not just adding one to the other. It was an infusion that required time, patience, and the fusion of their properties. She took the clay pot and boiled the water. When the water reached boiling point, she added the powder of the fire plant, watching the water take on a deep amber hue. She let it boil for a few minutes, allowing the essence of the fire plant to fully release. Then, with the heat low, she added the paste of the one-stroke plant. The smell in the cabin changed. The pungent, earthy aroma of the fire plant mingled with the soft, minty sweetness of the one-stroke plant. It was a complex, inviting perfume that seemed to envelop Ilara in a warm embrace. She watched the liquid bubble gently, the steam rising in a dense cloud, exactly as in the pictogram. The eye, in the double spiral, seemed to watch her, guiding her to the point of balance. She left the mixture to infuse for a time that seemed to be dictated by an ancestral intuition, a knowledge that now flowed through her. When she felt the time was right, she removed the pot from the fire. The liquid was now a reddish-brown color, opaque, almost creamy. She strained the elixir, separating the plant fibers from the precious liquid. The steam rising was intoxicating, a promise of healing. Ilara's heart beat strongly, but not from fear, but from an almost sacred expectation. This was the symphony. This was the combination. She poured the liquid into her pot, watching the steam dance. The smell was the perfect harmony, the strength of fire tempered by the gentleness of earth. There was no hesitation. She brought the pot to her lips. The first sip was unlike anything she had experienced. There was no intense shock of the fire plant, nor the bitterness of the first infusion. It was a gentle warmth that spread through her body, followed by a sensation of cooling and then a profound calm. It was as if a wave of well-being enveloped her, dissolving the last stiffness in her muscles, soothing any trace of pain or discomfort. Her lungs expanded, filled with pure, fresh air. The mental clarity that the fire plant had brought was now accompanied by a deep serenity. She felt a renewed energy, but not the raw, almost overwhelming energy from before. It was a balanced, sustainable energy that filled every fiber of her being. The tug in her belly completely disappeared, replaced by a sensation of warmth and protection, as if the elixir was also nourishing the life growing within her. Ilara closed her eyes, a tear rolling down her cheek. It was not a tear of pain or fear, but of relief and gratitude. The cure. She could feel it, deep and complete. It was more than the absence of disease. It was a restoration, a return to her strongest, healthiest self. The symphony had been played, and the result was perfect harmony. The journey had not ended, but the abyss had been crossed. She had deciphered the language of the herbs, the ancestral wisdom carved into the stones. The forest, once a refuge of despair, was now a sanctuary of knowledge and healing, and she, Ilara, was its guardian. She and her baby would survive. The certainty was unwavering. Only one last step, perhaps, to solidify this cure, to ensure it was lasting, to honor the wisdom that had saved her. But the hardest part, the most dangerous, seemed to be behind her. Ilara's body hummed with a quiet, deep energy. The combined elixir had settled, leaving behind not only the absence of illness, but a vibrant, almost youthful vitality. Her lungs drew air with an ease she hadn't known in years. Her muscles felt supple, and her mind, sharp as a freshly honed blade, was free from the fog of chronic fatigue. The warmth in her belly was no longer a faint tug of warning, but a comforting embrace, a cradle for the life thriving within her. She was whole. More than whole, she was renovated. However, the ancestral voice, now a whisper of intuition rather than a desperate plea, reminded her, only one last step, perhaps, to solidify this cure, to ensure it was lasting, to honor the wisdom that had saved her. The words echoed in her mind, a final challenge, an ultimate promise. The abyss had been crossed, but the bridge needed to be anchored. She returned to the carving wall, her fingers tracing the familiar symbols with a new understanding. The simple spiral, the double spiral with fire, the elaborate double spiral with the eye. Each a lesson learned, a step conquered. Her gaze fell upon the space below the last pictogram, a section she had previously dismissed as merely decorative, or perhaps too faded to decipher. Now, with her sharpened senses and clarity, a new image emerged, subtle yet distinct. It was not a leaf, nor a flame, nor a bubbling pot. It was a circle, intricately woven, with 3 smaller circles within it, each connected by a delicate line. From the central circle, a single strong line descended to what appeared to be a stylized representation of the earth, a mound with roots spreading underneath. Above the main circle, a small crescent moon, and below, a single clear drop of water. The cycle, Ilara whispered, understanding expanding in her mind. The totality, the connection. This was not about preparing another potion. It was about integration, about anchoring the cure not just in her body, but in her very being, and in the earth that had provided it. The 3 smaller circles within the main one were the 3 plants she had used. The 1-stroke plant, the fire plant, and the third, the one yet to be revealed, or perhaps it represented the past, present, and future, her, the baby, and the legacy. Her eyes followed the line descending to the earth. Roots, the ancient plantation. It was not just the leaves or the flowers. It was the very essence of the earth, the vital force that nourished all plants. And the drop of water, the purity of the source that kept her alive. The crescent moon, a symbol of renewal, of cycles, of protection for the life that was to come. She swept the cabin with her gaze. There was a small wicker basket she had found, forgotten in a corner. She picked it up, and with a makeshift shovel went out into the field of weeds that she now saw as a sacred garden. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting golden beams on the plants. She knelt, feeling the damp, cold earth beneath her knees. The pictogram of the 3 circles and the roots guided her. She was not looking for a specific leaf, but rather the root of a plant that seemed to be the oldest, the most robust, the one that seemed to radiate a silent energy. There was a plant with broad, dark leaves, which she had noticed but never touched, as it did not fit the previous descriptions. It seemed to be the matriarch of the field, its roots deep and firm. Carefully, Ilara began to dig around the base of this plant. The earth yielded easily, revealing a tangle of dark, fibrous roots. She selected a main root, thick and full of life, and cut it with her knife, feeling the plant's resistance, but also a silent permission. The smell of the root was earthy, deep, with a hint of spices she couldn't identify. It was the smell of the forest itself, of resilience, of life clinging to the earth. Back in the cabin, Ilara placed the root on the grinding stone, the pictogram of the water drop and the moon. It was not to be ingested directly, she realized. It was to be infused, but in a different way. Her grandmother had spoken of moon water, water collected under moonlight for rituals of purification and protection. Ilara didn't have moon water, but she had pure spring water. She took the clay pot and filled it with fresh spring water. Instead of boiling, she let the water sit, adding small pieces of the cut root. The idea was not to extract the essence by boiling, but to allow the root to infuse the water with its vital energy, slowly, under the influence of daylight, as if absorbing the very essence of time. She placed the pot in a sunny corner of the cabin, where the sunlight could touch the water and the root. While the root infused the water, Ilara returned to the carvings. The circle with the 3 smaller circles. She understood. It was the union of 3 forces, the one-stroke plant for relief and calm, the fire plant for purification and strength, and now the root for anchoring, longevity, protection. The symphony was not just for immediate healing, but for the maintenance of health, for the protection of the future. She waited. Time seemed to stretch and shrink in the cabin. She felt the energy of the root mingling with the water, a subtle, almost imperceptible transformation. Towards evening, when the sunlight was already faint, she felt that it was the moment. The water had taken on a faint golden hue, and the earthy smell of the root was now softer, almost sweet. Ilara strained the water, separating the root pieces. The liquid was clear, inviting. This was not a medicine to be drunk in large gulps, but an elixir to be revered. She picked up her pot and poured some of the liquid. The last step. She brought the pot to her lips. The taste was gentle, almost imperceptible, but with an underlying sweetness and the distant echo of the earth. There was no shock, no heat, no intense tingling, just a feeling of completeness. It was as if every cell of her body, already healed and revitalized, now received a seal of protection, a promise of durability. The most striking sensation was that of connection. She felt linked to the earth beneath her feet, to the air she breathed, to the water she drank, to the plants that had saved her. The forest was no longer a place of exile, but her home, her sanctuary, her source of wisdom. The fear that had driven her there, the despair that had consumed her, all dissipated, replaced by an unwavering peace. The tug in her belly, now a distant memory, was replaced by a radiant certainty. Her baby was safe, protected, growing in a body that had been restored to its fullness. The cure was not just for her, but for the life she carried. Ilara closed her eyes, a silent tear rolling down. This time it was a tear of pure joy and gratitude. She had deciphered the last secret, honored her grandmother's wisdom, and found not only the cure, but a new purpose. She was no longer the sick, desperate widow. She was Ilara, the guardian of knowledge, the mother who had fought and won. The journey was complete. The abyss had been crossed, the bridge built and anchored. She and her baby would survive and prosper, rooted in the wisdom of the forest, under the protection of the moon and the earth. The future, once a fog of uncertainty, now stretched clear and promising, a new cycle about to begin. The last sip of the root elixir descended smoothly, not with the urgency of medicine, but with the solemnity of an oath. Ilara felt a profound stillness settle within her being, a peace that transcended the absence of pain or the promise of health. It was the peace of one who had found her place in the world, who had understood a forgotten language and become part of an ancestral tapestry. Every cell of her body vibrated with a serene energy, the echo of a perfectly orchestrated symphony. The fog of illness had completely dissipated, revealing a mental clarity and vitality she thought she had lost forever. Her lungs expanded with the fullness of the forest's pure air, and the warmth in her belly was now a beacon of life, strong and constant, an unwavering promise. The journey indeed was complete. The abyss had been crossed, the bridge built and anchored. But the completeness, she felt, was not a static endpoint, but rather the threshold of a new beginning, a cycle that began with the strength of 1,000 springs. She was no longer the sick and desperate widow who had dragged herself to that cabin. She was Ilara, the guardian of knowledge, the mother who had fought and won, and who now carried not only a new life, but ancient wisdom. The tension that now enveloped her was no longer the fear of death, but the weight of responsibility. The forest, once a refuge of despair, was now a sanctuary of power, and she, its caretaker. The carvings on the wall were not just instructions for healing, but a map to a deeper existence, a connection to the earth and to the cycles of life. The ancient plantation was not mere weeds, but a legacy, a sacred garden that demanded respect, understanding, and protection. Ilara spent the following days in a state of grace and purpose. She no longer sought healing, for she already possessed it. Now she sought integration. Her movements were deliberate, each touch on the earth, each breath, an act of reverence. She walked through the field of plants, no longer as an explorer searching for a secret, but as a gardener who knows every leaf, every root, every flower. She learned to identify the plants not just by their healing strokes, but by their essence, their energy, their silent voice. The cabin, once a precarious shelter, transformed into a home. Ilara cleaned, organized, and infused the space with the energy of her new life. She created a small altar on the grinding stone, placing there the dried roots of the plants, some preserved leaves, and a bowl of fresh spring water, a constant reminder of the interconnectedness of all things. Sunlight streamed through the cracks, dancing over the carvings on the wall, which now seemed to glow with renewed meaning. With each passing day, her belly grew, and with it, the certainty that the life thriving within her was a reflection of the healing she had found. The baby was the personification of her triumph, living proof that hope and ancestral wisdom could overcome illness and despair. She talked to the baby, telling it about the plants, about the forest, about the grandmother who had left behind the map to life. The tension now lay in the choice. The world outside, the world that had rejected her and left her on the brink of death, still existed. She had found the cure. But was this cure to be kept secret or shared? Was the wisdom that had saved her a personal treasure or a legacy for humanity? Was the forest her private sanctuary or a beacon for those who also suffered? Ilara knew the answer would not come immediately. It was a path to be trodden, a new journey that would unfold with time. But she was ready. She had learned to listen to the forest, and the forest would guide her. One afternoon, as the sun set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Ilara sat on the cabin's porch, observing the field of plants. The wind whispered through the leaves, a soft, ancient melody. She felt a gentle tug in her belly, a movement from the baby, as if the small life within her was greeting the world. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the earth beneath her feet, the air in her lungs, the life in her womb. The cure was lasting, the protection unwavering, the future, once a fog of uncertainty, now stretched clear and promising. She and her baby would survive and thrive, rooted in the wisdom of the forest, under the protection of the moon and the earth. Ilara's journey had not ended with the cure. It had only begun. She was the bridge between the past and the future, the guardian of knowledge that could change lives. And as the darkness of night began to swallow the daylight, Ilara knew that no matter what the future brought, she was ready. She was the strength, the wisdom, the life. She was Ilara, and this was her legacy. The new cycle had begun,